The 20th century was just beginning, and the world was on the edge of a new era. The Industrial Revolution had turned cities into hives of smoke, steel, and ambition. Steamships crossed oceans, railroads stretched continents, and factories poured out goods faster than the world could buy them. It seemed humanity had conquered distance itself. In this age of progress, the ocean, once mysterious and feared, was now simply a thoroughfare. Every week, great liners steamed between Europe and America, carrying immigrants, businessmen, aristocrats, and dreamers. The Atlantic was now a highway of opportunity. Among the industry titans were two rivals, Britain's White Star Line and the Cunard Line. They competed fiercely for prestige, speed, and luxury. Cunard had the two magnificent greyhounds of the sea, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, fast, elegant, and admired. White Star wasn't interested in chasing speed alone. They aimed for something grander: comfort, elegance, and size. The plan was simple, yet audacious. They would build the largest, most luxurious ships ever, vessels so grand they would redefine ocean travel. In 1907, White Star Line's chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, met with Lord William Peary of Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast. Over cigars and brandy, the idea was born. Three nearly identical ships, each bigger and more magnificent than anything built before. They became the Olympic-class liners: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. Each would be a floating city, carrying over 2,000 people in unmatched style and comfort. The Titanic was the second built, improved, refined, and destined to be the greatest. Construction began on the Titanic in 1909, and the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast roared with activity. Over 3,000 men worked on the project: blacksmiths, riveters, carpenters, and engineers. The steel skeleton rose from the slipway like the frame of some giant creature. Sparks rained from torches, rivets clanged like bells, and the air was thick with the smell of iron and oil. The ship's sheer scale was staggering. She measured 882 feet long and 92 feet across, nearly 4 city blocks. The hull alone required more than 3 million rivets, and her engines weighed over 1,000 tons each. Inside, she had 4 towering funnels. Only 3 were functional. The fourth was added purely for aesthetic symmetry, because grandeur mattered as much as engineering. To the workers, the Titanic was more than a job. It was pride. They'd built ships before, but never anything like this. Many would later say they didn't just build her, they breathed life into her. As the ship took shape, word spread quickly. Newspapers called her a marvel of modern design, and some said she was proof that human progress had no limits. The public followed every detail: her dining rooms, her cabins, her massive engines that could push her through the Atlantic at a steady 21 knots. By 1911, the Titanic was nearly complete. Her great black and white hull gleamed under the Belfast sun. That May, thousands gathered along the River Lagan to watch her launch. At exactly 12:13 p.m., with a whistle and a cheer, the massive ship slid down the greased slipway into the water. It was a spectacle of human achievement, a moment of triumph for a city built on steel and skill. Once afloat, the Titanic entered her fitting out phase, months of completing her interiors and installing machinery. Craftsmen from all over Britain came to contribute. Woodworkers carved intricate panels of oak, mahogany, and satinwood. Artists painted ceiling murals and designed stained glass windows. Engineers fitted electrical systems, telegraphs, and lifts that carried passengers between decks. No expense was spared. The Titanic's first class accommodations rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. There were private promenades, reading rooms, smoking lounges, and a grand staircase that spiraled down through 5 decks beneath a glass dome. The dining saloon seated over 500 guests. Fine china bore the White Star crest, and silverware gleamed under electric chandeliers. Below decks, however, was a different world. Thousands of immigrants, Irish, Scandinavian, Eastern European, filled the third class cabins. Their quarters were simpler, yet cleaner and more comfortable than many had ever known on land. For them, the Titanic wasn't a luxury, it was a passage to a new beginning. What united everyone aboard, from the wealthiest passenger to the poorest stoker, was the sense that this ship represented the pinnacle of human progress. She was said to be unsinkable, her watertight compartments and steel bulkheads making her impervious to disaster. Even the press repeated the claim. It wasn't arrogance, at least not entirely. It was faith. Faith in science, in steel, and in the idea that human ingenuity could overcome the chaos of nature. The early 1900s were full of that optimism. Airplanes were flying, automobiles were multiplying. Everything seemed possible. By the spring of 1912, the Titanic was ready. She gleamed with fresh paint, her brass polished, and her flags snapped in the breeze. In the engine rooms, massive reciprocating engines waited to come alive. Every corridor smelled faintly of varnish and salt air. The crew prepared provisions, 40 tons of potatoes, over 1,000 loaves of bread, and enough meat to feed a small town. April 10th would be her maiden voyage, her first, and though no one could know it, her last. As the day approached, excitement grew. Society's elite rushed to book passage. Businessmen, aristocrats, heiresses, and adventurers. They saw the Titanic not just as transport, but as an experience, a statement of status and privilege. At the same time, hundreds of emigrants across Europe packed their meager belongings, clutching third class tickets. To them, the ship was a lifeline to a new world. In the early morning of April the 10th, 1912, the docks of Southampton came alive. Steam hissed from vents, baggage carts rattled, and porters called out names. Families embraced and said goodbye. As the tide rose, the Titanic's massive hull shimmered in the light. Her 4 funnels towered against the sky, painted in White Star's iconic buff and black. The ship's band played cheerful tunes as passengers filed aboard, greeted by stewards in crisp uniforms. At noon, the command was given. Mooring lines were cast off. Tugboats pulled her gently from the pier, and the crowd on shore waved and cheered. their voices fading as the ship's great propellers began to churn. Slowly and gracefully, the Titanic moved down the river test and into the open sea. Her voyage had begun. In that moment, few could imagine the tragedy that awaited her. The ship seemed invincible, a perfect machine gliding across the water. But beneath the optimism of the age, the ocean remained what it had always been: vast, indifferent, and quietly powerful. And though no one aboard knew it, the dream of the Titanic was about to meet the reality of the North Atlantic, where ambition and nature would collide in a story that would echo for generations. Once the Titanic left the docks of Southampton, her wake rippled quietly across the gray water of the English Channel. The harbor that had been full of cheers now fell away behind her, the shoreline shrinking until it looked like a smudge of smoke on the horizon. On board, thousands of passengers began to settle into what they believed would be a week of smooth sailing toward New York. For the crew, this was the moment months of preparation had led to. Nearly 900 officers, seamen, engineers, stewards, and cooks had been hired to operate the new liner. They knew every corridor, every lever, every hatch. Each department ran like a miniature city. The deck crew, commanded by Captain Edward Smith, the engine staff led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, the stewards trained to serve with clockwork precision. Captain Smith himself was a legend among sailors, calm, silver-haired, and respected by everyone under his command. He had spent more than 40 years at sea. Many passengers had booked passage simply because he was in charge. They called him the millionaire's captain. Beneath him stood a line of officers, including First Officer William Murdoch and Second Officer Charles Lightoller, experienced men who could read the sky, the stars, and the sea as easily as other men read books. They trusted the new ship completely. The Titanic was equipped with the latest technology available in 1912. Her bridge bristled with telegraphs and wheels, and her wireless room housed a brand new Marconi transmitter, able to send messages hundreds of miles across the Atlantic. Two operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked there around the clock, sending telegrams from wealthy passengers and receiving weather reports from other ships. Below decks, deep in the belly of the liner, lay the true heart of the Titanic, her engines. 29 massive boilers fed steam into triple expansion engines that turned the propellers. Coal dust hung in the air as firemen shoveled fuel into roaring furnaces. It was hot, deafening work. To keep the ship moving, more than 100 tons of coal had to be burned every day. Yet even here, amid heat and sweat, there was pride. The engineers knew they were powering the most advanced vessel ever built. Up above, in the passenger areas, a different world existed entirely. The first-class decks were bright and polished, filled with laughter and music. Wealthy travelers explored their surroundings like guests at a new palace. They marveled at the grand staircase with its wrought iron railings and domed skylight, the reading rooms paneled in oak, The smoking lounge finished in mahogany and leather. Every detail had been crafted to impress. Fine carpets, muffled footsteps. The temperature was kept constant by an electric heating system. Fresh flowers decorated every table. In their cabins, passengers could summon a steward with the press of an electric bell. For those in the grand suites, private promenades and fireplaces added an extra touch of extravagance. In second class, things were simpler, but still elegant. Families and professionals enjoyed spacious cabins, dining rooms with white linens, and even a small library. Many were teachers, merchants, or clergy, people of modest means, who found themselves sharing the same ship as the world's elite. And then there was third class, sometimes called steerage, a maze of narrow corridors far below. Here, hundreds of immigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, Italy, and Eastern Europe shared dormitory style rooms. The air smelled faintly of sea salt and coal. Meals were plain but hearty: porridge, bread, and stew. Children ran through the passageways, laughing in a dozen different languages. Though the conditions were humbler, even these passengers felt lucky. Few ships offered such clean quarters or decent food for the price. To them, the Titanic was not just a liner, it was hope, made of iron and steam. As the first day passed, the ship stopped briefly at Cherbourg, France, to pick up additional passengers, then again at Queenstown, Ireland, where tenders ferried more travelers aboard. When the last boat returned to shore, the Titanic set a direct course for the open Atlantic. Ahead lay nearly 2,000 miles of ocean. That evening, as the sun dropped below the horizon, the decks glowed under electric lamps. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, calm and silver under a rising moon. From the first class promenade, one could hear the faint hum of the engines and the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull. Inside, dinner was an event. The menu listed oysters, consommé, lamb with mint sauce, and chocolate and vanilla eclairs. A string quartet played softly while waiters glided between tables carrying crystal and silver. Conversation drifted about politics, business, and art. Elsewhere, in second class, passengers enjoyed roast beef and vegetables, chatting about their plans for America. In third class, a group of Irish travelers sang folk songs long into the night, their voices echoing faintly through the steel decks. The Titanic sailed on through perfect weather. The sea was smooth, the air mild. To everyone aboard, it felt as though the voyage could last forever. The ship barely swayed. Her immense bulk moved with steady grace. Some joked she was more hotel than ship. During the next days, passengers fell into routine. They walked the decks, read newspapers in the lounge, or played cards in the smoking rooms. Children explored the endless staircases and corridors, their laughter mixing with the distant pulse of engines below. Captain Smith and his officers maintained a steady course. Each noon, the position of the ship was marked on the chart. Telegraph messages continued to come in, reports of other liners, occasional mentions of ice farther north. Such warnings were common this time of year, and Smith, confident in his vessel, simply adjusted the route slightly southward. In the evenings, the band played in the first class lounge, while couples waltzed under chandeliers. Others gathered on deck chairs wrapped in blankets, watching the horizon fade from gold to indigo. Somewhere out in the dark, icebergs drifted silently, but to those aboard, the ocean felt tame, almost gentle. The crew drilled occasionally, checking lifeboats and watertight doors. Though few passengers paid attention, the Titanic was unsinkable. After all, that belief hung over everything like a quiet blessing. Down in the wireless room, Jack Phillips tapped out messages on the Marconi key. The sharp clicks echoed through the small cabin. Wealthy guests sent notes to friends in New York. Ship captains exchanged weather updates. Each successful transmission felt like a triumph of technology, proof that the world had grown smaller. On April 13th, a Saturday, the sea turned glassy and calm. Not a ripple disturbed the surface. The temperature dropped as the ship moved westward into colder waters. A pale mist began to form on the horizon. Passengers awoke the next morning to a clear, cold Sunday. It was April 14th, the day the Titanic would make history. None aboard could have known that in less than 24 hours, the pride of the White Star Line would vanish beneath the very ocean she was built to conquer. For now, everything seemed perfect. Children played on deck under the pale spring sun. Officers chatted quietly on the bridge. In the dining rooms, stewards prepared for another evening of elegance. The Titanic steamed ahead, her four funnels trailing thin ribbons of smoke against the blue sky. Somewhere far to the west, ice floated unseen, carried south by cold Arctic currents. The ship's wireless crackled with more warnings, but the messages were buried beneath a flood of personal telegrams. The night would be clear, they said. The stars would shine bright. And so, the Titanic pressed on toward the empty horizon, her passengers unaware that their magnificent voyage was nearing its fateful turn. April the 14th, 1912. The day began like any other aboard the Titanic. The sea was calm, the sky was clear. The passengers awoke to sunlight glinting off the water like scattered glass. Breakfast was served as usual. In first class, waiters carried silver trays of bacon, eggs, and toast. The sound of porcelain cups clinking filled the dining room. In second and third class, families gathered around long tables, enjoying warm bread and tea. By late morning, the Titanic was gliding through open ocean at full speed, a steady 22 knots. The great engines churned tirelessly below deck, the pistons pounding with mechanical rhythm. To the passengers, the motion was almost unnoticeable. The ship was so massive that the sea barely moved her. The day passed easily. Some of the first class passengers took part in Sunday services, held in the first class lounge. Captain Smith himself attended, standing quietly at the back of the room. Others walked the decks, bundled in coats, talking softly as the cold Atlantic wind brushed across their faces. The temperature had dropped since morning. A hint of frost hung in the air. By afternoon, the Titanic entered an area of ocean known for drifting ice. Several warnings had already been received, one from the Caronia, another from the Baltic, then the Californian. Each message mentioned icebergs and pack ice lying directly in the Titanic's path. Up on the bridge, the officers discussed them briefly, but the sea was like glass, and visibility seemed perfect. There was no reason to slow down, at least not yet. Wireless operator Jack Phillips was busy sending a backlog of personal messages. The Marconi machine buzzed continuously with crackling dots and dashes. Ice warnings came in between telegrams, and while some were acknowledged, others were delayed. The Titanic's wireless room was more focused on keeping the passengers happy than the officers informed. By evening, the ship's passengers dressed for dinner. The sun had set, and the cold deepened. The air outside was biting, near freezing. In the first class dining saloon, a feast was served: oysters, consomme Olga, salmon with hollandaise, lamb, duck, peaches in chartreuse jelly, and wine poured by the bottle. The laughter of the wealthy filled the room. Somewhere nearby, a string quartet played softly. In third class, supper was humbler: soup, bread, and jam, but spirits were high. Children ran through the corridors. A small group gathered in the common room to play music, the sounds of fiddles echoing faintly against the metal walls. At 9 p.m., Captain Smith stopped by the chart room. He reviewed the latest ice warnings with his officers, nodded, and gave a simple order: maintain course and speed. He then retired to his quarters for the night. At 9:20, another message arrived from the Californian. 3 large icebergs ahead. The signal was strong, but Phillips, overwhelmed with passenger telegrams, replied with a sharp, "Shut up, I'm busy." The Californian's operator turned off his set and went to bed. Above deck, the night grew colder still. The ocean was utterly calm, eerily so. The lookout platform, high above the deck, swayed gently as the ship pushed forward. 2 men stood watch: Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. They had no binoculars. They'd been misplaced back in Southampton. Their eyes alone would have to spot danger. By 10 p.m., most passengers had retired. The ship's lights glowed softly against the black sky. Inside, the orchestra continued to play as a few late-night guests lingered in the lounges. At 10:30, the temperature dipped below freezing. A faint haze clung to the horizon. The stars burned bright, so bright that it became difficult to tell where the sky ended and the sea began. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee scanned the darkness. The sea was flat, with no waves to break against any approaching ice. Icebergs would be nearly invisible until they were right on top of the ship. The time was 11:35. The 2 lookouts could hear only the sound of wind and distant machinery. Then, just 5 minutes later, at 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet spotted something ahead: a dark shape, motionless, towering. "Iceberg, right ahead," he shouted down the phone to the bridge. Sixth Officer James Moody responded instantly, repeating the words to First Officer William Murdoch. Murdoch reacted without hesitation. "Hard a starboard," he ordered. Then, full astern, the great ship began to turn, her bow slowly swinging left. but the Titanic was nearly 900 feet long and weighed over 46,000 tons. She couldn't turn sharply, not at that speed. For a moment, it looked as though she might clear the iceberg entirely. But then, a long, low sound, the faint scraping of steel against ice. The iceberg brushed along the starboard side, slicing through the hull plates below the waterline. The impact barely jolted the passengers. Most felt nothing at all. In the lower decks, however, the sound was unmistakable, a grinding, tearing noise that echoed through the corridors. Seawater burst through the gashes, flooding the forward compartments in seconds. Within 10 minutes, the first 5 watertight compartments were filling rapidly. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was summoned from his cabin. He inspected the damage quietly, lantern in hand. When he returned to the bridge, his face was pale. He turned to Captain Smith and said simply, "She's going down. It's a mathematical certainty." Smith was stunned. "Are you sure?" Andrews nodded. "The first 5 compartments are flooded. She can float with 4, but not 5. The Titanic had less than 2 hours before she would be beneath the waves. Down below, the passengers still had no idea what had happened. Some were awakened by a faint vibration. Others peeked into the corridors, saw nothing, and went back to bed. In first class, a few curious guests came out onto the deck, wrapped in blankets. They saw nothing unusual, just cold air and stars. A thin sheet of ice dusted the forward well deck, evidence of the iceberg's passing. The order was given to uncover the lifeboats. The crew hesitated. Few truly believed the ship was in danger. There was no panic yet, only confusion. Inside the wireless room, Phillips sent out a distress call. "CQD, CQD. Come at once. We have struck an iceberg." It was the first SOS in maritime history to be broadcast using the new code. Far away, the Carpathia received the signal and turned toward the coordinates. She was nearly 60 miles away, over 3 hours sailing distance. By midnight, the Titanic's bow was already beginning to dip. Passengers started to gather on deck, shivering in the freezing wind. The orchestra was summoned to play, not to entertain, but to calm nerves. Soft, familiar tunes drifted across the deck. The ship's great lights still shone brightly against the night. But below, in the flooding compartments, the sea was rising relentlessly. At 12:15 a.m., the first lifeboats were being prepared. Officers tried to convince passengers to get in, but many refused. The ship seemed perfectly safe. It didn't even look like it was sinking. Few realized that the Titanic's fate was already sealed. Midnight passed quietly. The North Atlantic stretched out in every direction, calm, silent, and black as ink. The Titanic floated in eerie stillness, her bow dipping just slightly lower than before. Most of the passengers were now awake, though few understood the gravity of what was happening. The ship still felt steady beneath their feet. The lights still glowed. The band still played. Up on the boat deck, officers and crew worked quickly, uncovering the lifeboats and swinging them out over the side. The icy air stung their faces, and frost began to form on the railings. Captain Smith moved among them in silence. His expression was calm but distant, the face of a man realizing the unthinkable. At 12:20 a.m., he ordered the lifeboats loaded with women and children first. It was an old maritime rule, one that would soon separate families forever. Many of the passengers hesitated. They didn't want to leave the ship. The deck beneath them felt solid. The lifeboats, by comparison, looked small, frail, unsafe. Some laughed nervously. Others argued. Why should we go? One woman asked. This ship can't possibly sink. But below, in the mailroom, in the boiler rooms, in the corridors, the truth was already undeniable. Cold seawater rushed in faster than the pumps could expel it. Thomas Andrews, the ship's builder, moved quietly from deck to deck, checking compartments, encouraging passengers to put on life jackets. His face grew grimmer with each passing minute. He knew exactly what was coming. The first lifeboat, number 7, was lowered at 12:40 a.m. It carried only 28 people, though it could hold 65. Many still refused to get in. The ship didn't look doomed. Not yet. As the lifeboats went down, one by one, the realization began to spread. The angle of the deck grew steeper. Dishes slid from tables. A deep, rhythmic hum came from the engines below. Not motion, but the shifting of massive machinery as water filled the lower decks. In third class, confusion turned to panic. Locked gates blocked access to the upper decks. Standard procedure to separate classes. Many passengers pounded on the barriers, shouting for help. Crewmen tried to unlock them, but precious minutes were lost. Down below, the narrow corridors filled with freezing water. Some passengers tried to wade through it, clutching children and luggage. Others turned back, trapped by flooding stairways. Above them, the orchestra continued to play. Wallace Hartley led the band through waltzes and hymns, their music drifting eerily across the still night. Survivors later said the last song they played was Nearer, My God, to Thee. By 1:30 a.m., the list of the ship was undeniable. The bow was now deep underwater, the stern rising visibly. Furniture slid across cabins, glass shattered. The great dome over the first-class staircase began to creak under the strain. The night had turned bitterly cold, around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The sea itself was colder still. The few who fell into it lasted only minutes before the cold overtook them. On deck, the officers tried to keep order. Lifeboat after lifeboat was lowered away. Some boats were half full, others nearly empty. Lifeboat number 1, meant for 40 people, launched with just 12 aboard, mostly first-class passengers. Captain Smith moved through the bridge and the deck in silence. Be British, he told his men, a calm command in the face of chaos. Moments later, he was gone. No one saw him again. Around 2 brass a.m., the last distress rockets were fired. White bursts of light exploded above the ship, then faded into the dark. On the horizon, the lights of another ship were visible, faint, distant, unmoving. It was the Californian, just a few miles away. But her wireless operator was asleep, and her crew misinterpreted the signals as celebratory fireworks. No help came. Water poured through the forward decks now. The great staircase flooded. chandeliers flickering out one by one. In the engine room, the last of the engineers stayed at their posts, keeping the lights on for as long as possible. At 2:10 a.m., the Titanic's stern was high out of the water, her propellers glinting under the stars. Passengers clung to railings, praying, crying, or standing silently in shock. The ship began to split. A deep, groaning roar echoed across the sea as steel tore apart under impossible pressure. The bow plunged downward, dragging the stern almost vertical. People slid, fell, or jumped into the freezing black water below. And then the lights went out. For a moment, there was only darkness and noise, the roar of collapsing decks, the crash of breaking glass, the cries of hundreds of voices swallowed by the ocean. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic was gone. The sea closed over the place where she had floated so proudly just hours before. The night grew quiet again. The only sounds left were the faint cries of those still alive in the water and the soft slap of waves against drifting wreckage. The lifeboats, scattered across the dark ocean, waited silently. Some passengers wept, others sat motionless, staring into the emptiness where the great ship had been. Above them, the stars continued to shine, cold, distant, and indifferent.
The Titanic rests now, deep beneath the cold Atlantic waves. Yet her story did not end when she sank. From the moment news of her loss reached the world, people have been fascinated by her. Newspapers chronicled every detail, and soon books were written. The public demanded answers. How could a ship designed to be unsinkable disappear so quickly? In the wake of the disaster, governments and shipping companies faced a harsh reality. The ocean is more powerful than any human creation. Regulations were changed. Lifeboats were required for every passenger. Wireless operators had to remain on duty around the clock. Ice patrols were established in the North Atlantic to watch for floating hazards. The Titanic became a turning point for maritime safety. Her loss taught lessons in humility, caution, and respect for the natural world. Ships would sail differently after that night. Every ocean liner that followed bore the imprint of the Titanic's tragedy. Stronger rules, safer designs, and more awareness of the unpredictable power of the sea. Beyond the rules and regulations, the Titanic lives in culture and imagination. Movies, novels, plays, and documentaries continue to tell her story. Songs are written about the ship, her passengers, her band, and the cold Atlantic night that swallowed her. Explorers descended to the wreck in submersibles, bringing back images of her broken decks, her massive boilers, the grand staircase frozen in time. Personal belongings, once lost, were recovered from the ocean floor. Shoes, plates, letters, pocket watches. Each item tells a fragment of a life aboard the ship, a story of hope, ambition, or simply the desire to reach a new world. Museums display artifacts recovered from the wreck. Visitors gaze at them quietly, imagining the people who owned them, imagining the calm of the ship before the night of the collision. Even today, more than a century later, the Titanic's name is still recognized worldwide. She represents not just a ship, but the human experience, our dreams, our pride, our mistakes, and our resilience. The story of the Titanic is not just one of tragedy. It is also a story of courage and compassion. Lifeboats were lowered, and some passengers gave their places to others. Many risked or lost their lives to save strangers. The heroism of her crew, the endurance of her survivors, and the memory of those lost have inspired generations. Her tale reminds us that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, we are never fully in control of the natural world. Even our most impressive creations are temporary, fleeting, subject to forces far larger than ourselves. And yet, there is a quiet beauty in this reminder. The Titanic was built with ambition and elegance, and for a brief moment, she sailed like a dream across the Atlantic. Even in her loss, there is a lesson in grace, determination, and the delicate balance between human ingenuity and nature's power. When we remember the Titanic, we remember more than the ship. We remember the people who dreamed aboard her, the lives that were lost, and the courage that emerged in the face of the unimaginable. In every museum, every book, every film, and every retelling, she drifts again across the waters of our imagination. Her story carries on, slow, steady, and eternal, like the gentle rolling of waves across the Atlantic. Even in sleep, even in silence, the Titanic whispers her story. She reminds us that we are part of something greater, part of a vast, unpredictable world. And so, her legacy endures, a reminder of ambition and caution, of beauty and fragility, of dreams that reach across oceans and time itself. As you drift further into calm, let the waves of her story carry you, gently, endlessly, into the quiet horizon of sleep. The Titanic sails on forever, in memory, in history, and in the imagination of all who hear her story.